Okay, hi. Just got done talking about globalization for the rest of the urban stuff. Okay, so I'm going to me, one of the important things to look at is the way race and power and money and politics interact with each other. But we're going to start talking about the city and sort of how it got to where it is today, kind of talking around the issue of race, and then we're going to bring it all together at the end here. Anyway, okay, so imagine this. Cities, when you can only walk, are about as far as you can walk, or as big as you can walk. When you can only walk places, cities are very economically isolated from the surrounding regions. You have people living together, living very closely together, and people living very close to where they work. You could say that's a good thing because people of different backgrounds are having to be next to each other, which is supposedly maybe is good for not being a bigot. Maybe not. If you like to walk to work, that's a plus. Downsides that people felt it was kind of noisy in the city. Rich people, as soon as they could, started to leave a little further out from the city and commute in because they like to have space and not have noise and be king of their castle. One of the big concepts here is cities, their growth as economic, their geoeconomic growth. Okay, it's going to be the fancy word: geographic, area, space, economic. Money, transactions, your economy, growth, and also geoeconomic spread. So geo can be put in front of a lot of words to make them all politically sciency and sound smart. Geodemographic, geoeconomic, geopolitical, geosociological, georeligious, geocultural, etc. Anywho, geoeconomic. This is actually a big deal, so perk up, 'cause here it comes. All right, so when you're in a 1600 city, 1600s city, like 1650, and you pretty much get around by walking on your feet. You have the city, and then there's very quickly and a very distinct cutoff point between the city and the rural surroundings, right? So the city just sort of builds up, and then it'll stop, and then it'll be rural countryside because the city can only grow as far as people can move about it. Excuse me. And in such a time, the city, in terms of its economic influence, was pretty much confined to those borders. There was not a lot of economic activity, economic exchange, transactions, money exchanges, things like that, between the surrounding rural areas and the city itself. They're very much, at least by even 18th century standards and today's standards, very isolated. So, and this is crucial, this changing to where we are today as a urban nation. As transportation, we have transportation advances, railroads, streetcars, horse-drawn buggy cars, subways, cars itself. The city is able to grow out geographically, right? Because now people, instead of needing to live within a mile of work to walk to and from work, they can live 10 miles from work or even 30 miles from work and commute and get there in 30 minutes or so. With subways and railroads, you can live even further out than that, and get there in a pretty good, within an hour. So that allows the city to expand. I have an example map of Boston, 24 through 27. Shows the city of Boston during the American Revolution, then about 100 years later. And the next map that's 100 years later shows some of the public transit lines, railroad lines that allowed people to move out from the city. Most, in this case, late 1800s, most of the jobs and economic activity is happening in the center of the city, but people are able to move out further away from it and get to work and then leave. And I will say, should say, this wasn't just a rich people escaping the noisy city thing. It was some of that, and rich people escaping non-rich people. But 1880, people are living together, using the restroom and not having very good sanitation systems and drinking water. And there was a lot of disease, and it sucked, and lots of people would die. I'm going to try and find one of these stats on here. It was pretty awesome. Well, hold on. I can't see myself. Okay. Awesome. It was about St. Louis and lots of people dying. Where is it? This is fascinating YouTubing, isn't it? I think it was from yellow fever. And I remember it saying 10% of St. Louis died. Let that sink in maybe for a minute as I stall for time. 10% of a city dying that's literally what decimating means. St. Louis was decimated by disease. Yes, found it. St. Louis in 1849 lost 1/10 of its population to cholera, not yellow fever, cholera. 4 years later, yellow fever led to the loss of lives of 11,000 people in New Orleans. The industrial age, with its smoke-belching factories and cinder-throwing train engines, cinder-throwing train engines, would only exacerbate the environmental problems of urban living. So people who could afford left because you don't want to die of cholera. It's reason in of itself, and damn, I wish people would have just stopped thinking there. I don't want to die of cholera, so I'm going to move. Why do you have to then say, also, I don't like the black people. If you just would have stopped there, maybe our history would have been a lot different, but whatever. So yeah, disease, whatever. And that's also, remember, let's bring this back to federalism. Remember, we talked about the different eras of federalism, and we're in the progressive era in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We have this mass migration into the cities. Lots of people are getting sick and dying. There's child labor issues, working condition issues that are trickling up or bubbling up in people's minds. We need somebody to step in and build a frickin' sanitation system, right? City can do that some, but federal government giving out money to help, great. And that's why we see that progression. And when we talked about annexation, real brief, go back, since it's on the screen in front of me. Boston, we see that Brookline did not become a part of Boston as it expanded outward, and that was because Boston was not able to annex Brookline. That's critical for you to know. The suburbanization, the incorporation of areas outside of the city had been going on before then, but Brookline being able to create its own city, incorporate, and resist the annexation to a city the size of Boston was a really big deal and a really big turning point, which gave a very significant precedent towards more suburbs being created and resisting, after they're created, annexation from the larger cities that they were sort of feeding people into. So cities start to grow with railroads and transportation because more people can live there, and they can travel farther in, farther out, to and from work. As transportation grows, as transportation advances. Sorry, I'm gonna check one thing. Okay. As transportation advances, we get railroads and stuff. It allows for the city to begin to economically interact with the surrounding region. So cities, before we had the geoeconomic situation of a city was basically within its political boundaries. So the city's economic activity happened within the area of the city's political boundaries, and that was kind of a good situation, because if you're rich, poor, you have a business, you don't have business, whatever, all of that economic activity is going on within the area that the city has jurisdiction over, and thus can tax you and use that tax money to provide services. With transportation making people go farther away, people can escape the city political boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries, thus escaping taxes if you're wealthier, while still being a part of the city's economic sort of base situation. So before, we had rural areas that were not really economically intermingled with the city because there just wasn't the ability to interact there. Now we have, if we look at Greensboro and Summerfield, as that was brought up today, I think it's 12, so yesterday now. Angela brought this up, Summerfield to Greensboro. Summerfield is able to, the residents of Summerfield are able to be economic participants in Greensboro without being subject to Greensboro's jurisdiction in terms of taxes and stuff. Does that make sense? And if you can see the problem that would cause, we talked about a vicious cycle before. The people who are able to move out to escape the city taxes but still be a part of the economic life that the city was able to provide were rich people. So tax bases go down and the city starts to struggle, but that doesn't again really start to be a problem until the 1950s-ish. So what happened in 1950? Well, let's back up real quick. Cities grow a lot up until 1950. There's industrialization in the middle of the city. We have the Industrial Revolution. Lots of people have moved to the cities. World War II was awesome in that everybody in America was working and created a huge boom. And people were moving to the cities because that's where the work was. So, you don't necessarily build airplanes. Where's a remote place? In the middle of the Arizona desert. I don't know. You don't build airplanes in the middle of the Arizona desert where people don't live. There's a city there. You're going to move there, and you're going to build the airplane there. Now you can choose different places to build an airplane. But if you're going to build a airplane, you're going to build it where people are because you need people to build the airplanes. Anyway, so people move to cities. Cities drastically increase in size. We have lots of public transportation investment, lots of investment in cities, investments in schools in the city, some really amazing public housing projects in the cities. It's kind of interesting. The public housing, when it really started going in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, was a really big deal and really important, and it was really impressive. Like, they were good places to live for people. However, and this could come as a shock to somebody, maybe one person, once rich white people left the city and had money and weren't involved in being in public housing to the same extent as, say, non-white people were, the political will to invest and create awesome public housing kind of disappeared. And there were lots of restrictions at that point placed on public housing that made public housing a lot worse than it really should have been. Public housing, very amazing, interesting subject in of itself. But there's only so much time to do stuff. So cities boom until 1950. What happens in 1950? We have one of the greatest national projects, my personal opinion, the greatest national project outside of the space program and moon landing. One of the single best things, or greatest flexing of America's united industrial muscle and scientific muscle, interstate highway system. That's if you ignore the racism, which we'll talk about in a minute. But 1950s, Eisenhower says, we're going to build this interstate highway system, and the United States just pours buttloads of money into building interstates all across the country. It was another great economic boom for the nation, not only because the federal government was spending money and people were getting to work, but imagine this, building highways lets trucks move from city to city quicker, reducing cost of products. Savings can get passed on to the consumer. There's more demand. People make more stuff. And then you have more people employed to take care of demand. There's this great cycle of economic activity that takes place. There are, just a side note, I guess, there are things that we could do today if the federal government would invest money that could act as a similar interstate highway system, and have the same sort of economic impact today. And it's been 60 years now of the interstate highway system being just an amazing economic engine for this country. We could do other things too that would do that, but the difference between the 1950s and the 2014s is that federalism thing again. 1950s, we had just come out of the Great Depression and World War II, and we had defeated the Nazis and the Depression. And trust in the federal government was at the all-time high. Also, the Soviet Union scared the bejesus out of people. So, Florida is the greatest state ever. Florida cannot beat the Soviet Union, unfortunately. Mississippi is basically the Soviet Union, except worse. So, essentially, what I'm trying to say is Mississippi sucks. But the United States as a nation had to come together, have this nationalistic spirit, we're from all over the country, but we have a common enemy, the Soviet Union, and they have nuclear weapons. And we've just come out of this time of the Great Depression and World War II, and we're all together, and the federal government is what unites us. We're Americans, we're not North Carolinians or Floridians, or in Mississippi's case, mole people. So, we're able to get the interstate highway system built, and people are able to be awesome about it because it's good for defense, good for economics, good for people being employed, etc. Today, it was just a much liberal time back then. Today, I mean, Obama's not liberal enough to build the interstate highway system, honestly. And even if he had an inkling to do something like that, there's no way he could even get anything like that done in Congress. But so a nice comparison for federalism as to how people feel about government and the role of government in people's lives and how that's changed. So interstate highway system, great boom, bad for cities, because people now are able to move way far away from the city center, outside of the city, beyond the reach, establish their own little suburban communities that resist being annexed by the center city, and you have this great exodus of people leaving the cities for the suburbs. Population loss. Slide 31. Cleveland had little over 914,000 people in 1950. By 2010, Cleveland had 396,000 people in it. I want to clarify, this is within the city limits, not necessarily the Cleveland area. Now, Cleveland area, I don't know if it's actually grown or not. I know some of these areas have definitely increased in population, the metropolitan areas, but the city limits itself. DC 800,000 to 1950 to 600,000 2010, and it was worse than that for a long while. DC, the city of DC, has experienced a decent population spike recently, or in the past couple years. Detroit, we talk about how much Detroit is in trouble. Here's why. In 1950, the city of Detroit had 1.8 million people living in it. Within the city limits, Detroit had 1.8 million people. There's several things going on there. One, that is a lot of people to tax. That is a lot of people occupying homes in dense areas. That's a lot of people to take care of and have expanded city services and things like that. In 2010, there are 713,000 people within the Detroit city limits. Certainly that's more than Cleveland and DC and Boston and St. Louis. But the drop and how the drop happened made it really bad. Detroit, so going from 1.8 million to 700,000, not only are you losing 1.1 million people that you can tax, but you're losing the wealthier people because the poor people can't move out of the city because they don't have the means to. You're also now having in Detroit large swaths of land within the city completely vacant. If not completely vacant, you'll have streets with maybe a couple people living on them. The city of Detroit needs to police this entire area, police the entire city of Detroit. But when you have the needs of a police force to serve 800,000 people, but they're spread over this huge area that used to be for 1.8 million people, it gets very hard, and you actually almost need more police cars because they need to travel farther. There's a lot of inefficiency and waste, and it costs more per person and whatever. Same thing with fire, school, sanitation. Things just cost more money per person, and it sucks. So Detroit, that's sad for them. There's some other cities on there that lost population. Stress again, just because a city lost population does not mean the area lost population. Boston, for example, has millions of people in the area, not 600,000. The thing here, though, is again going back to that geo-economic idea. In 1950, to be a part of the economic activity of a city, of say Boston, you had to be within the city limits or fairly close to the city limits. By 1960, 1970, after the interstate highway system is built and more people are owning cars and stuff, you can now live much farther away, and the Boston sort of geoeconomic influence is much greater. Excuse me. Unfortunately, the political boundaries don't expand with it, and you have this tax services difference where you have not enough taxes and too many services that are needed. And you're the city of Boston. You still have a lot of jobs within your city. Fingers crossed, and we'll talk about why that in a second. But you're the city of Boston. You're still, in some ways, providing city services for everybody that lives within your sort of economic sphere of influence. But you're only getting contributions from a few of those people. People that live in the suburbs, in my opinion, are, what do they call them? Free riders? It's a free rider problem. They're moochers. They pay taxes for their own suburbs, but the people in Summerfield, no offense if you live in Summerfield, it's great. I love the area. Friends that live out there, which sounds bad when you say, "Oh, I have a friend that lives there." However, or it's not that I hate blank. I have best friends who are blank. Anyway, Summerfield doesn't exist. Doesn't get its wealth. Doesn't get its services. Doesn't get its sort of cultural, enjoyable activities without Greensboro and the investment Greensboro makes in their community. Now, for example, the library systems, I know that Guilford County, for people that don't live in Greensboro, they can still get access to Greensboro's library. So, hold on, let me repeat that. People that live in Guilford County but not within the city limits of Greensboro, the people that live outside of Greensboro can use Greensboro's public library, and Guilford County gives money to Greensboro Public Library to help pay for the people that don't live in the city, thus don't pay taxes to support the library. So that's the way but it's not, while if I live in Greensboro, I may be paying $3 to support the library. If you're in Guilford County, you're maybe spending $1 to support the library. It's not an even whatever. So, economic sphere of influence increases. The number of people that a city needs to support in some way or another more or less stays the same, but the number of people it can tax decreases, and the amount of money those people have that the city can tax decreases also. I point out the political fragmentation, the metropolitan balkanization of St. Louis, and the stresses caused by suburbia. When you have, so St. Louis, if you look at slide 32, you see, I feel like you can get a sense by looking at the map how large St. Louis is in terms of its economic sphere of influence. People that live in this sort of area that I have marked out there, you would probably think of them as being more or less from St. Louis. They probably have jobs in St. Louis, or near there have friends go to St. Louis for, entertainment. The fact that St. Louis exists there is the reason why the people that live outside of St. Louis have things to do on the weekend in a lot of cases. So you have this large area, this metropolitan area, that is one, big economic area with people moving all throughout it. People moving all throughout it. How do I want to say this? But, so people moving all around it. What you would maybe want to happen, this is an assertion, a statement that can be challenged. What you would think you would want to happen is maybe have a regional planning body. Because if you're going to have people moving very freely within this greater St. Louis metropolitan area, if you want people to move freely, efficiently, get the most sort of bang for the buck in terms of providing services to people, do things like make sure there aren't traffic jams or as few traffic jams as possible, do smart urban planning so that things run smoothly. You want there to be a centralized authority that can do that. St. Louis, though, has 91 different governments that have to somehow work together, negotiate together to create an efficient plan to make sure St. Louis has smart urban growth. Okay? How likely is that to happen? Probably not very likely. Maybe. Some instances it can. There can be certain, like maybe 10 municipalities that are in this one area get together and say, we're going to do some smart urban growth to make sure, you know, we spend money efficiently and citizens have the best lives and economic activity can flourish in the area. However, in a lot of cases, the reason why people create small municipalities, incorporate in small areas, is because they don't want to deal with anybody else in the world. So they're not going to. And that creates a lot of problems. We talked about, or we, the world, I don't know if we have, but we will in 1 second. Commuting problems, traffic problems, things like that. These things are exacerbated by the lack of a unified planning of a metropolitan area, of a, you know, geographic, economic area in a real sense, as opposed to planning based upon sort of outdated urban boundaries. Example, moving from that, Atlanta. I love Atlanta. I'm going there soon. Love Atlanta. My parents, or my mom's from Atlanta. Considered it a second home for a very long time. It's a complete and utter mess in terms of its urban planning and urban layout. A couple things led to that, okay? So, one, you have the same kind of metropolitan balkanization problem that St. Louis does. I have a map 35. Atlanta's huge geographically. If you look at that map I put on there, that reddish pinkish area that's shaped kind of like Alabama in the middle, that's the city boundaries of Atlanta. That's what Atlanta has jurisdiction over, where their tax base comes from, outside of maybe some other payments that may come from the other municipalities surrounding it. But essentially, that's what Atlanta's looking at. There are 400, maybe 500,000 people that live within that area. The greater metropolitan area of Atlanta has about 5 million. So 90% of the population that Atlanta's urban sort of urban area, the people they serve is outside of the city limits. And there are lots of municipal governments that, again, and this is an example where they can be actively hostile towards each other for perhaps an obvious reason, which we'll get to. But, you know, Atlanta's famous for its really bad traffic. That's what happens when you have everybody move to the suburbs with the inability or the unwillingness for the different suburban communities to work with the city center and with each other in creating smart urban growth. And this is kind of what we're talking about a little bit here, is how home rule, moving, decentralizing local authority and local control to even smaller and smaller communities. This happened after 1968, 69, 70, 71 is when it really started taking off, and then Reagan really or the Reagan Revolution really punched it through. What might have happened during that time that might have caused the decentralization and the need for people, or the want for certain people to wall themselves off from the rest of the world, could be civil rights and desegregation. Exactly what happened, and here's what happened in Atlanta. So Atlanta moves forward to try and build a public transportation system. Okay, Atlanta has MARTA. It's the bus and rail system in Atlanta, public transportation. To connect, there's 5 counties that sort of serve as Atlanta's metropolitan area. Atlanta and Fulton County try to work together with like Cobb, Decatur, Franklin. Is that one of the counties? Anyway, trying to work together to counties to create a smart urban growth plan, so that all these people moving to the suburbs can still interact with the city and it doesn't cause massive problems. For example, like traffic jams and stuff. DeKalb, Gwinnett, Gwinnett, DeKalb, Fulton, Clayton's in there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, Douglas doesn't really count. There's one. Anyway, here's what happens. Atlanta's like, let's build MARTA. Let's build public transit. Let's connect all these areas that are moving away from the city to the city itself, so that people can have access to jobs, have access to being able to live in different places, and we'll see why that's important. I'll talk about why that's important. But here's what happens. 2 counties say, yes, let's build MARTA. The 3 other counties that make up Atlanta say, hell no. We don't want anything to do with MARTA. Why did those 3 suburban counties reject it? Because they did not want the influx of undesirables from Atlanta. This was in the 70s, and undesirables were black people. That's what they didn't want. And that's why MARTA is not a better public transportation system it is today, which has not, mostly I guess it's hurt black people that live in Atlanta and people that live in the city limits in general, because there isn't this ability to, access different parts of the city for jobs and whatever. But it's created the traffic jams, and if you look at slide 37, which is me being perhaps cruel, but remember, what was it, January this year? You had that massive snowstorm, ice storm that went through Atlanta that caused people to sleep in schools, convenience stores. They were in their cars. Some people were in their cars for 24 hours or more. White people of Atlanta, or the Atlanta area, got what they deserved. The choices that the people of Atlanta made, especially the people in the suburbs, made from the 1960s and 70s, because they're afraid of black people and the civil rights movement, caused them to pursue urban growth, urban political strategies that intentionally created a wall to prevent the mixing of people from the different cities, or at least would give them access through cars to the city, but people who live in the city who are poor can't get out to them because cars and public transit doesn't go out there. However, when you have situations like this, you have traffic jams, white people get all complainy and stuff, and I say take some personal responsibility for your actions. You lived in the suburbs. You don't want to fund public transportation. Suck it up. And that's I can get kind of frustrated sometimes with this lesson, so that's my soapbox for the moment. So that's what happened there, and that's something that's repeated throughout the nation. And let's go back. Well, let's talk about another stressor with the suburbs and with the city. With more people moving out to the suburbs, we actually have now begun to see jobs leaving the city and moving to the suburbs. And we see these things that are now called sometimes technoburbs. Generally, they're suburbs built around some sort of like technology thing. But what the suburbs do to attract well-paying jobs from the city to the suburbs, and then to attract the people to fill those jobs, is they pursue these sort of mini urban development strategies. So now you'll have relatively large office parks, residential, and commercial buildings all within this area. It creating kind of like a mini downtown, but in the suburbs where there are only rich white people. It's essentially what's happening today and now, and that's part of what's going on. My uncle lives in a place called Celebration, Florida. I don't know if anybody's heard of that. It's something that actually gets talked about a little more than its size would suggest, probably because it's a pre-planned Disney community. It's a town. Disney said, "Hey, we're going to build a town." And they built a town. There's not like Mickey Mouse running around. It's just this very rich community in a suburban community. And here's the deal with those: they have houses that are kind of close together, like you might see in a city. They have a walkable downtown area where all the retail shops, nightlife, things like that are centered in this downtown area where people can go and enjoy the nightlife. But they have other things like ordinances about how big your house needs to be. And they say your house needs to be a certain size or bigger because that means the houses are more expensive. And that means certain people can't move there. And so you get all these sort of like urban benefits, things that people like from the city, but you only have to interact with people of your socioeconomic status and race, is what a lot of this again is driven by. And so there's these things very similar to it. Technoburbs. A lot of the technoburbs sometimes are driven by, technology, upper class, technology jobs, very liberal minded people in general, and generally a lot of white liberals. There's this sort of political narrative about that where all these self-righteous white liberals get together and we're living in a livable community where you can ride your bike or walk to work, and it's just a small little community that we live in, and outside of Seattle, but we've really embraced sustainability because there's we have high density buildings, and you walk to work and you can ride your bike to work, and everybody drives a Prius, and we have this really nice trendy downtown area which really supports local businesses and blah blah blah. Of course, the whole like problem with that, or the whole thing that narrative is missing for the smug white liberals, is the fact that they've created this community with rules and in locations and with certain expenses that prohibit anybody who's not rich, white, and liberal from living there, essentially. So it's easy. Again, this is a soapbox a little bit while explaining what's happening. The soapbox, I guess, it's easy to feel all smug and self-righteous when everybody around you is smug and self-righteous. So maybe now you know what I think about trendy white liberal suburbs in places like Seattle and elsewhere. Slide 39, we've talked about metropolises. So, you know, the city of New York is actually geographically fairly large, which is good for the city of New York. Let's move something else. Atlanta. Okay, so Atlanta, small geographic area for its boundaries, but large economic activity area, which, you know, causes those problems we talked about in terms of services the city needs to provide versus the money it can bring in, because there's, you know, 90% of the population isn't going to be able to be taxed by Atlanta. We have these things now that are sort of created mega regions. It's on 39. This is America in 2050 sort of projection, and we're seeing this right now, slowly moving to it, where economic activity isn't even within like the Atlanta metro area, but now can go between Atlanta and Charlotte metro area as telecommunication capabilities develop, telecommunications, internet, phone, voice communications, being able to work from home. As the areas get more spread out, people move further and further away from city centers, but then still create many city centers as they move out, these little white liberal technoburb enclaves. Not saying white conservatives don't have their own little urban techno or urban enclaves. My uncle certainly lives in one in Celebration, Florida. It's just the liberals that piss me off because they're the hypocrites. Anyway, sorry, liberals. But you see, I mean, if you look at the map, you can see their prediction of Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh, you know, even Greensboro, Winston-Salem, to Birmingham, Alabama mega region, as people move along the interstate systems and create these towns, and these jobs sort of are spread out in that area. And as that happens, or as we move on, there's also projection about not just telecommunication advances, but transportation advances. Maybe we'll have a high-speed rail something by then. I don't know. But Greensboro, Winston-Salem, High Point, Jamestown, Burlington, that's one economic region. And that's a pretty good size economic region, right? You got the Triangle, Chapel Hill, Raleigh, Durham. That's a interconnected economic region. It's a mega region, it's a metropolis, I would say, maybe more. But people commute from Raleigh to Greensboro and Greensboro to Raleigh and Winston-Salem to Chapel Hill, and all along that area is almost itself a mega region, right? I mean, there is some degree of economic interconnectedness between all the area, and as things progress, it only looks like we'll be moving towards greater economic integration between, all the places between Winston-Salem and Raleigh, as jobs and people move and people commute further and things like that. And again, this causes urban planning problems because of the fact that, well, two ways. One, Greensboro and Winston-Salem need to work together to maybe create a solid transportation plan to move people efficiently from one city to the other, because that's just the way things are working now. And two, this is something that we've seen before, but we're seeing less of now. Cities are starting to wisen up to it. Greensboro and Winston-Salem would often compete for jobs. So there's a really great example of Dell 10 years ago, 8 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. Greensboro, Guilford County, Forsyth County, Winston-Salem were competing for this Dell processing plant. Dell was going to make this big investment, build this big plant. I don't know why. It was going to staff something like 700 to 1,000 people. That's a significant amount, but I think some of the cachet of it being Dell and a computer company made the 1,000 people working there seem like more and better. Anyway, fierce competition. You have both Guilford County and Greensboro and Forsyth County and Winston-Salem are bidding against each other to get Dell to move to within their borders. How are they bidding against each other? They're throwing money at Dell to try and get them to come to the city. They're saying, we won't tax you for 5 years. So then Winston-Salem comes back and says, we won't tax you for 10 years. Greensboro says, we're not going to tax you for 15 years, plus we'll build the damn plant for you. Wasn't exactly what happened, but the competition was real. Eventually, Dell landed in Forsyth County, stayed there for, I don't think it was a full 10 years, and then announced it was shutting down. All that money, the taxpayers went to court Dell to provide jobs, sort of. Sorry, you get some money and then it's gone. Or you provide some money and then Dell takes it. I'm going to pause there and then come back in a second and talk about that suburban transportation, poor people, jobs issue with an example of the new Atlanta Braves Stadium. So, okay, so my favorite baseball team, the Atlanta Braves. As I said, my mom's from Atlanta. My grandfather and my grandmother are from Atlanta. My grandfather's granddaddy, he's dead. It's sad. He died in 1998, so it's not like a fresh tragedy, but it sucked. My grandmother is alive, and I love her dearly. She lives in Tallahassee now, to be close to my mom, and my aunt also moved down there, and she's like 80, 81. She'll be 81 this December. So, sometimes old people, it's good for them to live near relatives. Anyway, so she left. So, but I love the Atlanta Braves. Favorite team of all time. Baseball is the greatest thing ever. I tell my fiance the most important things to me in order are the Atlanta Braves, opposable thumbs, her. So that's sad for her. Anyway, The Braves announced recently that they're building a new stadium. So right now they play in Turner Field, which is in downtown Atlanta. It's the southern edge of downtown Atlanta. For all intents and purposes, it is kind of a sucky location, okay? It doesn't have the greatest access in terms of public transportation. It's a pain for cars to get in and out of. It's just not that ideally located for those reasons. However, the Braves are moving their stadium to the 285 75 Interstate 75 junction. If you look at the map on 35, 285 is the circle, the interstate circle that goes around Atlanta, and 75 is the interstate that goes out towards Smyrna. If you look at that, northwest. And the site of the Braves' new stadium will be just on the north side of 285 and 75. They got a space there. They're building it. Whatever. Cobb County, that's where it is. So it's moving. The stadium is moving out of the city limits of Atlanta to the suburbs, to Cobb County. Cobb County is providing about half of the funding to build the new stadium. The Braves have one really good reason to move out there. Atlanta has 450, 500,000 people that live in it. The Braves are on the south side of downtown in Atlanta. Atlanta has about 5 million people that live in the area. Most of them live north of Atlanta, and the rich ones live north of Atlanta. So their stadium will be closer now to the rich people that could buy tickets, I guess. Now, here's the problem. Here's like the job problem, the urban planning problem, the public transportation problem with this, and how it exacerbates poverty within cities and sort of the problem cities have in general. So, the Braves Stadium, Turner Field, is in Atlanta. Not the greatest place, not the greatest access to public transportation, but it's certainly accessible. You can do it. And it's in Atlanta. So, who works at the stadium? I'll give you all a second to think about it. Who's the usher, the concession stands people, ticket grabbers, ticket sales people? Time's up. People working generally on an hourly wage, lower income, and overwhelmingly minority. You want everybody to have a living wage. I think everybody wants that. Everybody wants everybody to live, comfortably. We maybe don't think everybody's entitled to Bill Gates' richness, but if you're willing to work hard, hopefully you can, not live your life in debt, not knowing if you're going to eat. The Turner Field job doesn't necessarily provide that fully for the, probably 1,000 or so people it employs. But that's money rather than no money. Here's what's going to happen. They're going to demolish Turner Field. They're going to build the new stadium in the suburbs of Atlanta where public transportation does not go, or it is accessible by public transportation, but instead of taking maybe 2 buses to get there. You're going to take a rail, a bus, a bus, a bus, a bus. You'll have a 30-minute bus commute to a hour and a half, 2-hour bus commute if you work at the current Turner Field and you want to keep your job at the new stadium they're building in the suburbs. So what does that do? That means jobs have left the city and have moved to the suburbs. We have poor people in the cities that don't have access to personal transportation, a car. They rely on public transportation to get around. They rely on public transportation to get to their job. And now, job creator, the field, Turner Field, the Braves, are moving out of the city away from the people that before were, working there. And those are going to be people who are more than likely not going to be able to access Turner Field as a place to work, or the new Braves Stadium once it moves to the suburbs. They're all going to be out of a job. It'll be interesting to see who are the ushers and the concessions people and things like that at the new Turner Field. The area it's moving to is not as poor as the area it's from, not in a long shot. It'll be interesting to see if it turns into kind of like a Chick-fil-A where it's a bunch of 16-year-olds, white, upper-class 16-year-olds working there, as opposed to, a 35-year-old black single mom who's using the job to pay for food for her kid. But yeah, so that's another problem of suburbanization. That's what happens, and that helps exacerbate the issues we have in the cities today. The jobs leaving, this inability to get out there. Okay, I'm going to hit the pause button there, save this. I might break this up also, and we'll move on, and then I'll do a separate video on the remaining part to break it up. So next, we'll talk about the case study in Fort Trumbull, at Fort Trumbull, which is a neighborhood area in New London, Connecticut, and we'll talk about the issue of race in cities. So